Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we begin with Part 1, Foreword, Author's Preface and Introductory, from Hidden Life in Freemasonry by Charles Webster Leadbeater. The Hidden Life in Freemasonry by C.W. Leadbeater, 33rd degree. The Masonic Temple Colored. Foreword. It is once more my privilege to usher into the world, for the helping of the thoughtful, another volume of the series on the hidden side of things, written by Bishop Charles W. Leadbeater. True Mason that he is ever trying to spread the light which he has received so that it may chase away the darkness of chaos. To look for the light, to see the light, to follow the light, were duties familiar to all Egyptian Masons, though the darkness in that ancient land never approached the density which shrouds the West today. This book will be welcomed by all Freemasons who feel the beauty of their ancient rite and desire to add knowledge to their zeal. The inner history of Masonry is left aside for the present, and the apprentice is led by a trustworthy guide through the labyrinth which protects the central shrine from careless and idle inquirers. Places that were obscure become illuminated. Dark illusions are changed to crystal clarity. Walls which seem solid melt away. Confidence replaces doubt. Glimpses of the goal are caught through rifts in the clouds, and the earthborn mists vanish before the rays of the rising sun. Instead of fragments of half-understood traditions, confused and uninterpreted, we find in our hands a splendid science and a reservoir of power which we can use for the uplifting of the world. We no longer ask, what is the great work? We see that it is nothing less than a concerted effort to carry out the duty that is laid upon us, as those who possess the light, to spread that light abroad through the world, and actually to become fellow laborers with the grand architect of the universe in his great plan for the evolution of our brethren. The detailed explanations of the ceremonies are profoundly interesting and illuminative, and I commend them very heartily to all true Freemasons. Our very illustrious brother has added a heavy debt of gratitude by this book to the many we already owe him. Let us be honest debtors. Annie Besant, Adyar, December 25, 1925. Author's Preface. The Masonic Fellowship differs from all other societies in that candidates for membership have to join it blindfold and cannot receive much information about it until they actually enter its ranks. Even then, the majority of Masons usually obtain only the most general idea of the meaning of its ceremonies and seldom penetrate further than an elementary moral interpretation of its principal symbols. In this book, it is my object, while preserving due secrecy upon those matters which must be kept secret, to explain something of the deeper meaning and purpose of Freemasonry, in the hope of arousing among the brethren a more profound reverence for that of which they are the custodians, and a fuller understanding of the mysteries of the craft. Although the book is primarily intended for the instruction of members of the co-Masonic order, whose desire, as is expressed in their ritual, is to pour the waters of esoteric knowledge into the Masonic vessels, I hope nevertheless that it may appeal to a wider circle, and may perhaps be of use to some of those many brethren in the masculine craft who are seeking for a deeper interpretation of Masonic symbolism than is given in the majority of their lodges, showing them that in the ritual which they know and love so well are enshrined splendid ideals and deep spiritual teachings, which are of the most absorbing interest to the student of the inner side of life. Before we can gain this fuller understanding, we must have at least some slight acquaintance with certain facts concerning the world in which we live, a world only half of which we see or understand. Indeed, undignified as the statement sounds, it is quite true that our position resembles very closely that of a caterpillar feeding upon a leaf, whose vision and perception extend but very little beyond the leaf upon which he crawls. How difficult it would be for such a caterpillar to transcend his limitations, to take a wider view, to understand that his leaf is part of a huge tree with millions of such leaves, a tree with a life of its own, a life outlasting 1,000 generations of lives such as his, and that tree in turn only a unit in a vast forest of dimensions incalculable to his tiny brain. And if by some unusual development, one caterpillar did catch a glimpse of the great world around him and tried to explain his vision to his fellows, how those other caterpillars would disbelieve and ridicule him, how they would adjure him to waste no time on such unprofitable imaginings, but to realize that the one purpose of life is to find a good position on succulent leaf and to assimilate as much of it as he can. When later on he becomes a butterfly, his view widens and he comes into touch with a beauty, a glory and a poetry in life of which he had no conception before. It is the same world and yet so different merely because he can see more of it and move about in it in a new way. Every caterpillar is a potential butterfly, and we have the advantage over these creatures in that we can anticipate the butterfly stage and so learn much more about our world, come much nearer to the truth, enjoy life much more and do much more good. We should study the hidden side of everyday life, for in that way we shall get so much more out of it. The same truth applies to higher things, to religion, for example. Religion has always spoken to mankind of unseen things above, not only far away in the future, but close around us here and now. Our life and what we can make of it largely depend upon how real these unseen things are to us. Whatever we do, we should think always of the unseen consequences of our action. Some of us know how useful that knowledge has been to us in our church services, and it is just the same in Freemasonry. Though this vast inner world is unseen by most of us, it is not therefore invisible. As I wrote in The Science of the Sacraments, there are within man faculties of the soul which, if developed, will enable him to perceive this inner world, so that it will become possible for him to explore and to study it, precisely as man has explored and studied that part of the world which is within the reach of all. These faculties are the heritage of the whole human race. They will unfold within every one of us as our evolution progresses, but men who are willing to devote themselves to the effort map gain them in advance of the rest, just as a blacksmith's apprentice specializing in the use of certain muscles may attain, so far as they are concerned, a development much greater than that of other youths of his age. There are men who have these powers in working order, and are able by their use to obtain a vast amount of most interesting information about the world which most of us as yet cannot see. Let it be clearly understood that there is nothing fanciful or unnatural about such sight. It is simply an extension of faculties with which we are all familiar, and to develop it is to make oneself sensitive to vibrations more rapid than those to which our physical senses are normally trained to respond. It is by the use of those perfectly natural but supernormal faculties that much of the information given in this book has been obtained. Anyone who, having developed such sight, watches a Masonic ceremony, will see that a very great deal more is being done than is expressed in the mere words of the ritual, beautiful and dignified as they often are. Of course, I fully understand that all this may well seem fantastically impossible to those who have not studied the subject at first hand. I can but affirm that this is a clear and definite reality to me, and that by long and careful research extending over more than 40 years, I am absolutely certain of the existence and reliability of this method of investigation. It is no new discovery, for it was known to the wise men of old, but like so much else of the ancient wisdom, it has been forgotten during the darkness of the early Middle Ages, and its value is only gradually being rediscovered. So to many it appears unfamiliar and incredible. We have only to remember how utterly inconceivable the wireless telegraph, the telephone, the aeroplane, or even the automobile would have seemed to our great-grandfathers, in order to realize that we should be foolish to reject an idea merely because we have never heard of it before. Only a few years ago, the powers of research put at our disposal by the invention and development of the spectroscope were as far beyond popular thought as those of clairvoyance are now. That by it we could discover the chemical constitution and measure the movements of stars thousands of millions of miles away might well have been regarded as the baseless fabric of a dream. May not other discoveries be impending? Men of high scientific attainments such as Sir Oliver Lodge, Sir William Crookes, Professor Lombroso, Monsieur Camille Flammarion and the late Professor Myers, who have taken the trouble to inquire into this matter of inner sight, have convinced themselves that this faculty exists. So if there be those among the brethren to whom this claim seems ridiculous, I would ask them notwithstanding to read on and see whether the knowledge obtained by a means which is strange to them does not nevertheless supply for obscure or incomprehensible points in our ritual an explanation which commends itself to their reason and common sense, that which gives them a better grasp of the meaning underlying the mysteries of our craft and thereby increases their veneration and love for it, cannot be unworthy or absurd. Any student who wishes to know more of this fascinating subject may be referred to a little book entitled Clairvoyance, which I wrote some years ago. I should like strongly to recommend for the perusal of my brethren of the craft 2 books by Worshipful Brother W.L. Wilmhurst, The Meaning of Masonry and The Masonic Initiation. I have myself read them with great delight and profit and have gathered many gems from their pages. Note: while this paragraph is missing in first edition, in second edition it is indicated as part of first edition. I desire to offer my heartiest thanks to the Reverend Herbrand Williams, MC, B.A., for his kindness in placing at my disposal his vast stores of Masonic erudition and for many arduous months of patient and painstaking research. Also to the Reverend E. Warner and Mr. St. John for the careful drawing of the illustrations, and to Professor Ernest Wood for his untiring assistance and cooperation in every department of the work, without which the production of the book would not have been possible. CWL Second Edition. In this second edition, a few trifling corrections have been made, and some additional information has been given with regard to certain higher degrees. CWL. Chapter 1, Introductory. Personal Experience. The origins of Freemasonry are lost in the mists of antiquity. Last century, there were many who thought that it could be traced no further back than the medieval guilds of operative Masons, though some regarded these in turn as relics of the Roman collegia. There may still be some who know no better than that, but all students of the ancient mysteries who are also Freemasons are aware that it is along that line that we find our true philosophical ancestry. For there is much in our ceremonies and teachings which could have had no significance for the mere operative Mason, though when examined by the light of the knowledge received in the mysteries, it is seen to be pregnant with meaning. Many Masonic writers claim various degrees of antiquity for the craft, some assigning its foundation to King Solomon, and one at least boldly stating that its wisdom is all that now remains of the divine knowledge which Adam possessed before his fall. There is, however, plenty of evidence less mythical than that. And to that evidence, I happen to be able to contribute a fragment of personal experience of a rather unusual kind. By devoting some years to the effort and many more years to practice, I've been able to develop certain psychic faculties of the kind mentioned in the Foreword, which, among other things, enable me to remember the previous existences through which I have passed. The idea of pre-existence may be new to some of my readers. I do not propose now to advance arguments in its favor, though they exist in abundance, but simply to state that for me, as for many others, it is a fact of personal experience. The only one of those previous lives of mine with which we are here concerned was lived some 4,000 years before Christ in the country which we now call Egypt. When I was initiated into Freemasonry in this life, my first sight of the lodge was a great and pleasant surprise, for I found that I was perfectly familiar with all its arrangements, and that they were identical with those which I had known 6,000 years ago in the mysteries of Egypt. I'm quite aware that this is a startling statement. I can only say that it is literally true. No mistake is possible. Coincidence will not serve as an explanation. The placing of the 3 chief officers is unusual, the symbols are significant and distinctive, and their combination is peculiar, yet they all belong to ancient Egypt, and I knew them well there. Almost all the ceremonies are unchanged. There are only a few differences in minor points. The steps taken, the knocks given, all have a symbolical meaning which I distinctly remember. Egyptian evidences. Knowing these facts to be so from my own experience, I set to work to collect ordinary physical plane corroborative evidence for them from such books as were within my reach, and found even more than I had hoped. The explanation of the first-degree tracing board begins by remarking that the usages and customs among Freemasons have ever borne a near affinity to those of the ancient Egyptians, but does not furnish us with any illustrations of the points of similarity. These are to be found in Brother Churchward's most illuminative books, Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man and the Arcana of Freemasonry, also in the Arcane Schools, by Brother John Yarker, and Freemasonry and the Ancient Gods by Brother J.S.M. Ward. I will proceed to summarize with grateful acknowledgement the information derived from these volumes. Masons of various degrees will be able to select from it the features which remind them of their own ceremonies. Some interesting illustrations have been collected from the wall pictures of ancient Egypt and from vignettes on various papyri, chiefly from the Book of the Dead, of which there are many recensions. It is clear from these sources that the formation of the temple in Egypt was a double square, and in the center were 3 cubes standing one upon another, forming an altar upon which were laid their volumes of the sacred law, not the same as our own, of course, for ours had not yet been written. Those cubes represented the 3 aspects or persons of the Trinity, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, as may be seen from the signs engraved on them, see Figure 1, which, however, is copied not from an Egyptian altar, but from an illustration in Mr. Evans' book on Crete. But at a later period, we find only a double cube. There were 2 pillars at the entrance to the temple, and on them were squares representing earth and heaven. One of them bore a name which signified in strength, while the name of the other signified to establish. This gateway was regarded as leading to the higher world of Amenti, the world where the soul was blended with immortal spirit, and thereafter established forever. So this was the figure of stability. At the entrance of the lodge, there were always 2 guards armed with knives. The outer was called the Watcher, the inner was known as the Herald. The candidate was divested of most of his clothing and entered with a cable tow and hoodwink. He was led to the door of the temple and there asked who he was. He replied that he was Shu, the suppliant or kneeler, coming in a state of darkness to seek for light. The door was an equilateral triangle of stone which turned on a pivot on its own center. As the candidate entered, he trod on the square, and in so doing it was supposed that he was treading on and leaving the lower quaternary or personality of man in order to develop the higher triad, the ego or soul. In modern Masonry, the same idea is expressed in the first lecture, where it is stated that a Mason comes to the lodge to learn to rule and subdue his passions and to make further progress in Masonry. He was conducted through long passages and led round the lodge 7 times, and after having replied to many questions, he was eventually brought to the center of the lodge, and there asked what he required. He was told to answer, light. In all his perambulations, he had to begin with the left foot. If the candidate violated his obligation, so it is stated in the Book of the Dead, his throat was cut and his heart torn out. Another degree is mentioned in the papyrus of Nesi Amsu, where it is said that the body was cut to pieces and burnt to ashes, and these were spread over the face of the waters to the 4 winds of heaven. There is in the temple of Knumu in the island of Elephantine, just off Assuan, a bas-relief which shows us 2 figures, one of the pharaoh and the other of a priest wearing the ibis headdress of Thoth, standing in an attitude strongly suggestive of the 5 points of fellowship, though not exactly agreeing with our present practice. See Plate 2a. It is intended to represent an initiation, and the word given is Mat-Heru, which means true of voice, or one whose voice must be obeyed. I've also seen a painting in which 4 attendants are depicted saluting a pharaoh with the penal signs of an immediate past master, and the sign of silence is often to be found on the monuments and is characteristic of Horus. The gavel was then made of stone and was a model of the double-headed axe. In those days, the aprons were made of leather and were triangular. That of the first degree was pure white, as it is now, but the master mason's apron was brilliantly colored and heavily jeweled with tassels of gold. See Plate 1. Our 24-inch gauge was represented by a cubit of 25 inches. The blazing star in the center of the lodge existed, but it had 8 points instead of 6 or 5. It was called the Star of Dawn, or the Morning Star, and represented Horus of the Resurrection, who is pictured as bearing it upon his head and as having given it to his followers. The Masonic square was well known and was called Nekah. It is to be found in many temples and also appears in the Great Pyramid. It is said that it was used for squaring stones and also symbolically for squaring conduct, which once more resembles the modern interpretation. To build on the square was to build forever, according to the teachings of ancient Egypt. And in the Egyptian Hall of Judgment, Osiris is seen seated on the square while judging the dead. See Plate 2b. Thus the square came to symbolize the foundation of eternal law. The Egyptians used the rough and the smooth ashlars with much the same meaning that Masons attach to them today. A wand surmounted by a dove is represented not only in ancient Egypt, but also in some of the monuments in Central America, and those who bore it were called conductors. It is a curious fact also that the descendants of the Nilotic Negroes, who emigrated long ago from Egypt to Central Africa when called to take an oath in a court of law, still do so with a gesture were I at liberty to describe it in writing, would be universally recognized by the craft. Another point that struck me much on looking at engravings of vignettes in the Book of the Dead is that the hailing sign of the fellow craft is depicted perfectly clearly. A group of people is shown as worshipping the setting sun or paying respect to it in that attitude. This Book of the Dead, as it has been somewhat unfortunately called, is part of a manual which in its entirety was intended as a kind of guide to the astral plane, containing a number of instructions for the conduct both of the departed and the initiate in the lower regions of that other world. The chapters which have been collected from the various tombs do not give us the whole of that work, but only one section of it, and even that is much corrupted. The mind of the Egyptian seems to have worked along exceedingly formal and orderly lines. He tabulated every conceivable description of entity which a dead man could by any possibility meet, and arranged carefully the special charm or word of power which he considered most certain to vanquish the creature if he should prove hostile, never apparently realizing that it was his own will which did the work, but attributing his success to some kind of magic. The Book of the Dead was originally intended to be kept secret, although in later days certain chapters were written on papyrus and buried with the dead man, as is said in one of the texts. This book is the greatest of mysteries. Do not let the eye of anyone look upon it, that were abomination. The book of the master of the secret house is its name. In ancient Egypt they recognized 7 souls or life forces coming forth from the Most High. Students of Eastern philosophy call them the primordial 7, and they are mentioned in the book of Dzyan. 6 of these were pre-human. The 7th was our humanity and was brought forth from the virgin Neith. The symbol attached to that bringing forth was that of the pelican, who was fabled to draw blood from her own breast in order to feed her young. This later became a prominent symbol in the Rosicrucian philosophy, which seems to have been derived largely from Egyptian teaching. We read in Egyptian hieroglyphics of the 1 and the 4, referring to Horus and his 4 brothers. Of that we also read in the stanzas of Dian, and another expression common to both is the 1 from the egg. In Egypt, the egg was the symbol for the setting sun, which is often seen in that shape when about to touch the horizon. That egg passed into the underworld and was hatched there, and out of it came the young sun the next morning, rising in his strength, which was called the flame born of a flame. All this bore a deeply mystical significance, which was explained in the mysteries. When Osiris died, Isis and Nephthys in turn tried to raise him, but it proved a failure. Then Anubis attempted it and succeeded, and Osiris returned to the world with the secrets of Amenti, a significant statement which seems to suggest that the secrets which we possess are closely connected with the underworld and the life after death. These are some of the most striking of the evidences which I have been able to collect, and there are others which may not be written. I feel that many more can probably be found, but even these, when taken together, make any theory of coincidence impossible. There is no doubt that this to which we have the honor to belong today is the same fraternity which I knew 6,000 years ago, and it can indeed be carried back to a far greater antiquity still. Brother Churchward claims that some of the signs are 600,000 years old. That is quite likely to be true, for the world is very ancient, and assuredly Freemasonry has one of the very oldest rituals existing. We must of course admit that the mere appearance of one of our symbols does not necessarily involve the existence of a lodge, but at least it shows that even so long ago as that, men were thinking along somewhat the same lines, and trying to express their thoughts in the same language of symbol that we employ today. Preservation of rituals and symbols. That the rituals and symbols should have been preserved to us with so wonderfully little alteration is surely a marvelous thing. It would be inexplicable but for the fact that the great powers behind evolution have taken an interest in the matter and gradually brought people back to the true lines when they had swerved somewhat away from them. This business was always in the hands of the Chohan of the seventh ray, for that is the ray most especially connected with ceremonial of all kinds, and its head was always the supreme hierophant of the mysteries of ancient Egypt. The present holder of that office is that master of the wisdom of whom we often speak as the Comte de Saint-Germain, because he appeared under that title in the 18th century. He is also sometimes called Prince Rákóczi, as he is the last survivor of that royal house. Exactly when he was appointed to the headship of the ceremonial ray, I do not know, but he took a keen interest in Freemasonry as early as the 3rd century AD. We find him at that period as Albanus, a man of noble Roman family born at the town of Verulam in England. As a young man, he went to Rome, joined the army there, and achieved considerable distinction in it. He served in Rome for some 7 years at any rate, perhaps longer than that. It was there that he was initiated into Freemasonry and also became a proficient in the Mithraic mysteries, which were so closely associated with it. After this time in Rome, he returned to his birthplace in England and was appointed governor of the fortress there. He also held the position of the Master of the Works, whatever that may have meant. He certainly superintended the repairs and the general work in the fortress at Verulam, and he was at the same time the imperial paymaster. The story goes that the workmen were treated as slaves and wretchedly paid, but that St. Alban, as he was afterwards called, introduced Freemasonry and changed all that, securing for them better wages and greatly improved conditions generally. Many of our brethren must have heard of the Watson manuscript of 1687, in that a good deal is said about St. Alban's work for the craft, and it is specially mentioned that he brought from France certain ancient charges which are practically identical with those in use at the present time. He was beheaded in the persecution by the Emperor Diocletian in the year 303, and the great abbey of St. Alban was built over his remains some 500 years later. In the year 411, he was born in Constantinople and received the name of Proclus, a name which in afterlife he was destined to make famous. He was one of the last great exponents of Neoplatonism, and his influence overshadowed to a great extent the medieval Christian church. After that, there is a gap in his list of incarnations as to which at present we know nothing. We find him reborn in the year 1211, and in that life he was Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar who was a reformer both of the theology and the science of his day. In 1375 came his birth as Christian Rosenkreutz. That also was an incarnation of considerable importance, for in it he founded the secret society of the Rosicrucians. He seems some 50 years later, or a little more than that, to have used the body of Hunyadi János, an eminent Hungarian soldier and leader. Also, we are told that about 1500 he had a life as the monk Robertus, somewhere in Middle Europe. We know practically nothing about that as to what he did or in what way he distinguished himself. After that comes one of the greatest of his births, for in the year 1561 he was born as Francis Bacon. Of that great man we hear in history little that is true and a great deal that is false. The real facts of his life are gradually becoming known, largely by means of a cipher story which he wrote secretly in the many works which he published. That story is of entrancing interest, but it does not concern us here. A sketch of it may be found in my book, The Hidden Side of Christian Festivals, from which I'm epitomizing this account. A century later we are told that he took birth as Józef Rákóczi, a prince of Transylvania. We find him mentioned in the encyclopedias, but not much information is given. After that, considerable mystery surrounds his movements. He seems to have traveled about Europe and he turns up at intervals, but we have little definite knowledge about him. He was the Comte de Saint-Germain at the time of the French Revolution, and worked much with Madame Blavatsky, who was at that period in incarnation under the name of Père Joseph. He also appears to have disguised himself as Baron Ompesh, who was the last of the Knights of St. John of Malta, the man who arranged the transfer of the island of Malta to the English. This great saint and teacher still lives, and his present body has no appearance of great age. I myself met him physically in Rome in 1901 and had a long conversation with him. In co-masonry, we refer to him as the head of all true Freemasons throughout the world and in some of our lodges. His portrait is placed in the east above the chair of the Right Worshipful Master and just beneath the Star of Initiation. Others place it in the north, above an empty chair. Upon his recognition and assent as head of the Seventh Ray, the validity of all rites and degrees depends. He often selects pupils from among the brethren of the Masonic order and prepares those who have fitted themselves in the lower mysteries of Masonry for the true mysteries of the Great White Lodge, of which our Masonic initiations, splendid though they be, are but faint reflections, for Masonry has ever been one of the gates through which that White Lodge might be reached. Today, but few of his Masons acknowledge him as their sovereign Grand Master, yet the possibility of such discipleship has ever been recognized in the traditions of the order. It is said in an ancient catechism of masculine Masonry, "As a Mason, whence come you? From the West. Whither directing your course? To the East. What inducement have you to leave the West and go to the East, to seek a master, and from him to gain instruction?" Fortunately, our ancestors have recognized the importance of handing down the working unchanged. Some few points have been dropped during that vast lapse of time. A few others have been slightly modified, but they are marvelously few. The charges have become longer, and the non-officials take less part in the work than they used to do. In the old days, they constantly chanted short versicles of praise or exhortation, and each one of them understood himself to be filling a definite position, to be a necessary wheel in the great machine. From this knowledge, several points emerge. It is noteworthy that the Masonic ceremonies, which have so long been supposed to be rather in opposition to the received religion of the country, are seen to be themselves a relic of the most sacred part of a great ancient religion. Like every product of these ancient and elaborately perfected systems, these rites are full of meaning, or rather of meanings. For in Egypt we attributed to them a fourfold signification. Since every detail is thus full of import, it is obvious that nothing should ever be changed without the greatest care, and only then by those who know its full intent, so that the symbology of the whole may not be spoiled. The Egyptian outlook. It is exceedingly difficult to explain to 20th century readers all that this work meant to us in the sunny land of Chem, but I will try to describe the four layers of interpretation as they were taught when I myself lived there. The first idea of its meaning was that it conveyed to us and symbolized in action the way in which the great architect had constructed the universe, that in the movements made and in the plan of the lodge were enshrined some of the great principles on which that universe had been built. The vortical movement in the sensing, the raising and lowering of the columns, the cross, the anchor, and the cup upon the ladder of evolution. All these things and many more we interpreted in that way. The different degrees penetrated further and further into the knowledge of his methods and of the principles upon which he works. For we not only held that he worked in the past, but that he is working now, that his universe is an active expression of him. In those days, books filled a far less prominent place in our lives than they do now, and it was considered that to record knowledge in a series of appropriate and suggestive actions made a more powerful appeal to a man's mind and established that knowledge better in memory than to read it from a book. We are therefore preserving by our unvarying actions the memory of certain facts and laws in nature. Because that is so, and because the laws of the universe must be universal in their application and must act down here as well as above, we held that the great architect expected from us a life in accordance with the law which he had made. The square was to be applied literally to stones and buildings, but symbolically to man's conduct. And man must arrange his life in agreement with what obviously followed from these considerations. Therefore, the strictest probity was demanded and a high level of purity, physical, emotional, and mental. Perfect rectitude and justice were required, and yet at the same time, loving kindness and gentleness, and in all cases doing unto others what ye would that they should do unto you. So Masonry is indeed a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. But it is a system based not on an alleged commandment, thus saith the Lord, but on definite facts and laws in nature, which cannot be doubted. The work is a preparation for death and for what follows it. The two pillars, Boaz and Jachin, were supposed to stand at the entrance to the other world, and the various experiences through which the candidate passed were intended to symbolize those which would come to him when he passed out of this physical world into the next stage. There's a vast amount of information about the life after death to be derived from an intelligent consideration of Masonic ceremonies, and through constantly practicing them, these worlds will become really familiar to us, so that when we shall pass beyond the grave, no longer in figurative death, we shall feel ourselves quite at home in repeating once more what we have so often enacted in symbol within the lodge. Above all, it is emphasized that the same laws hold good on the other side of the grave as on this, that in both states we are equally in the presence of God, and that where that holy name is invoked, there can be no cause for fear. The fourth intention is the hardest of all to explain. To make you understand that, I must try to take you back, if I can, into the atmosphere of old Egypt and to the attitude that religious men held there. I do not know whether it is possible to reconstruct that in these modern days, which are so hopelessly, so fundamentally different. The religion which we know best at the present day is intensely individualistic. The great central objective put before most Christians is that of saving their own souls. That duty is represented to be of primary importance. Can you picture to yourselves a religion just as much a religion in every way, in every respect as earnest, as fervid, as real, from which that idea was entirely absent, to which it would have been utterly inconceivable? Can you think, as a beginning, of a condition of mind in which no one feared anything accepting wrong, and its possible results in delaying unfoldment, in which men looked forward with perfect certainty to their progress after death, because they knew all about it, in which their one desire was not for salvation but for advancement in evolution, because such advancement brought them greater power to do effectively the hidden work which God expected of them. I am not suggesting that everyone in ancient Egypt was altruistic any more than are all the people in modern England, but I do say that the country was permeated with joy and fearlessness so far as its religious ideas were concerned, and that everyone who by any stretch of courtesy could be described as a religious man was occupied not with thoughts of his personal salvation, but with the desire to be a useful agent of the divine power. The outer religion of ancient Egypt, the official religion in which everyone took part, from the king to the slave, was one of the most splendid that have ever been known to man. Gorgeous processions perambulating avenues miles in length amid pillars so stupendous that they seemed scarcely human work. Stately boats in a medley of rainbow colors sweeping majestically down the placid Nile, music triumphant or plaintive, but always thrilling. How shall I describe something so absolutely without parallel in our puny modern times? The common dress of all classes in Egypt was white, but in contradistinction, their religious processions were masses of splendid, glowing color. The priests wearing vestments of crimson and a gorgeous blue supposed to represent the blue of the sky, and many other brilliant colors also. The life of ancient Egypt, as indeed of modern Egypt, centered round the river Nile. Slow-flowing and majestic and richly decorated barges were used for all purposes of transit, and also for the celebration of religious festivals. On these, the priests were arranged in certain symbolical figures, standing or sitting, and all wore the colors appropriate to the particular aspect of the deity which they symbolized. Not only were solemn sacrifices offered to the gods upon these barges at altars wonderfully adorned with flowers and precious embroideries, sometimes built up by stages to 100 feet or more in the air, but living pictures or scenes were also enacted upon them, having a symbolical meaning connected with the festival which was being celebrated. In such ways was represented the judgment of the dead, with the weighing of the heart by Anubis against the feather of Mart, the characters of Anubis and Thoth being played by priests who wore the appropriate masks. I remember also a very gruesome performance of the dismemberment of Osiris, in which his body was cut into pieces and then put together again. Not the body of a real person, of course, but nonetheless very realistically enacted. These splendid processions swept down the river between the thronging multitudes of worshippers, shedding the benediction of the gods as they passed by, and evoking tremendous enthusiasm and devotion in the people. The ancient Egyptians have often been accused of polytheism, but in reality, they were no more guilty of the charge than are the Hindus. All men knew and worshipped the one God, Amen-Ra, the one without a second, the center of whose manifestation on the physical plane is the sun. But they worshipped him under different aspects and through different channels. In one of the hymns addressed to him it was said, "The gods adore thee, they greet thee, O thou, the one dark truth, the heart of silence, the hidden mystery, the inner God seated within the shrine, thou producer of beings, thou the one self. We adore the souls that are emanated from thee, that share thy being, that are thyself. O thou that art hidden, yet everywhere manifest, we worship thee in greeting each God's soul that cometh forth from thee and liveth in us." The gods were not considered to be equal with God, but rather to have attained union with him at various levels, and therefore to be channels of his infinite power to mankind. The cult of the gods was in reality but little different from the cult of angels and saints in the Catholic Church. Just as Christians look to St. Michael and to Our Lady as real personages and hold festivals in their honor, so in ancient Egypt adoration was offered to Isis and Osiris and to other deities likewise. In the ultimate, these august names referred to aspects of the Godhead, Amen-Ra, for the Trinity in Egypt was represented by Father, Mother, Son, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, instead of the Christian presentation of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But below that divine level, there were then, as there are now, great beings in whom the ideal was embodied, who acted as representatives and as channels of God's threefold power and grace to man. Furthermore, there are hierarchies of angels belonging to these different lines, just as there are hierarchies of angels who follow the leadership of St. Michael and of Our Lady, each of whom is a channel and representative of his order according to the level of his development. The celebration of the ritual of Isis, for instance, always attracted her attention and invoked the presence of angels of her order, who acted as channels of the divine blessing in that wondrous aspect of the hidden truth which she represented. The hidden work. No doubt the really religious man took his part in all the outward pomp which I've described, but what he prized far above all its amazing magnificence was his membership in some lodge of the sacred mysteries. A lodge which devoted itself with reverent enthusiasm to the hidden work which was the principal activity of this noble religion. It is of this hidden side of the Egyptian cult, not of its outer glories, that Freemasonry is a relic, and the ritual which is preserved in it is a part of that of the mysteries. To explain what this hidden work was, let us draw a parallel from a more modern method of producing a somewhat similar result. The Christian plan for spreading abroad the divine power or grace is principally by means of the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, commonly called by our Roman brethren the Mass. We must not think of that grace as a sort of poetical expression or as in the least degree vague and cloudy. We are dealing with a force as definite as electricity, a spiritual power which is spread abroad over the people in certain ways, which leaves its own effect behind it and needs its own vehicles, just as electricity needs its appropriate machinery. It is possible by clairvoyance to watch the action of that force, to see how the service of the Eucharist builds up a thought form through which that force is distributed by the priest with the aid of the angel invoked for that purpose. It has been so arranged that the attitude of the priest, his knowledge, even his character, does not in any way interfere with the due effect of the sacrament. There is in any case an irreducible minimum which is transmitted. So long as he performs the prescribed ceremonies, the result is achieved. If he is also a devout man, those who receive the sacrament at his hands have the additional benefit of a share in his love and devotion, but that in no way affects the value of the sacrament itself. Whatever his failings, the divine strength is outpoured upon the people. The old Egyptian religion had the same idea of pouring out spiritual force upon all its people, but its method was altogether different. The Christian magic can be performed by the priest alone, and may even be done quite mechanically. But the intelligent assistance of the laity greatly increases its power and the amount of force which can be outpoured. The Egyptian plan, however, positively required the earnest and intelligent cooperation of a considerable number of people. It was therefore much more difficult to achieve perfectly, but when thoroughly done, it was far more powerful and covered a much wider range of country. The Christian scheme needs a vast number of churches dotted all over the land. The Egyptian plan required only the action of a few grand lodges established in the principal cities in order to flood the whole kingdom with the hidden light, the work of the ordinary lodges being regarded as subsidiary to these and rather as a training ground for membership in the grand lodges. The central doctrine of the religion of the ancient Egyptians was that the divine power dwelt in every man, even the lowest and most degraded, and they called that power the hidden light. They held that through that light, which existed in all, men could always be reached and helped, and that it was their business to find that light within everyone, however unpromising, and to strengthen it. The very motto of the pharaoh was, "Look for the light," implying that his supreme duty as king was to look for that hidden light in every man around him, and strive to bring it forth into fuller manifestation. The Egyptians held that this divine spark, which exists in everyone, could most effectively be fanned into flame by transmuting and bringing down to the three lower worlds the tremendous spiritual force, which is the life of the higher planes, and then pouring it out over the country, as has been described. Knowing that spiritual force to be but another manifestation of the manifold power of God, they gave to it also the name of the hidden light, and from this double use of the term confusion sometimes arises. They fully recognized that such a downpour of divine grace could be evoked only by a supreme effort of devotion on their part, and the making of such an effort, together with the provision of suitable machinery for spreading the force when it came, was a great part of the hidden work to which the noblest of the Egyptians devoted so much of their time and energy. And this was the fourth of the objects intended to be served by the sacred and secret ritual of which that of masonry is a relic. The Egyptian race. The Egyptian race of the period of which I have been speaking was of mixed blood, but dominantly Aryan. Our researchers show that about 13,500 BC, a band of men and women belonging to the highest classes of the great South Indian Empire, which then existed, set out on an expedition to Egypt by way of Ceylon, having been directed to do so by the Manu. The ruling race in Egypt in those days was a branch of what has been called in theosophical books the Toltec subrace, a branch probably identical with that Cro-Magnon race which inhabited Europe and Africa somewhere about 25,000 BC. In Ancient Types of Man, Sir Arthur Keith remarks that this race was mentally and physically one of the finest that the world has ever seen. Broca has noted that the brain content of the skull of the Cro-Magnon woman surpasses that of the average male of today. The average height of the men of this race was 6 feet 1.5 inches. The shoulders were exceedingly broad and the arms short as compared with the legs. The nose was thin but prominent, the cheekbones high and the chin massive. It happened that the king or pharaoh on the throne at the time when the expedition from South India arrived had a daughter, but no son, his wife having died in childbirth. The newcomers were received with great cordiality by both king and high priest, and intermarriage with the strangers became a coveted honor in the Egyptian families, especially as the king had approved the marriage of his daughter with the leader of the band, who was a prince of India. In a few generations, the Aryan blood had tinged the entire Egyptian nobility, and this produced the type well known from the monuments, which had Aryan features but the Toltec coloring. After many centuries, there came a ruler who was influenced by a foreign princess, whom he had espoused, to cast aside the Aryan traditions and establish lower forms of worship. But the clan drew together and, by strictly marrying only among themselves, preserved the old customs and religion as well as their purity of race. Nearly 4,000 years after the arrival of the Indians, there arose in Egypt certain prophets who foretold a great flood. So the clan in a body took ship across the Red Sea and found a refuge among the mountains of Arabia. In 9,564 BC, the prophecy was fulfilled. The island of Poseidonis sank beneath the Atlantic Ocean in the deluge mentioned in the Timaeus of Plato. At the same time, the land rose and made the Sahara Desert, where a shallow sea had been before, and a vast tidal wave swept over Egypt, so that almost its entire population was destroyed. Even when everything settled down, the country was a wilderness, bounded on the west no longer by a peaceful sea but by a vast salt swamp, which as the centuries rolled on dried into an inhospitable desert. Of all the glories of Egypt, there remained only the pyramids towering in lonely desolation, a state of things which endured for 1,500 years before the clan returned from its mountain refuge, grown into a great nation. But long before this, half-savage tribes had ventured into the land, fighting their primitive battles on the banks of the great river, which had once borne the argosies of a mighty civilization, and was yet to witness a revival of those ancient glories, and to mirror the stately temples of Osiris and Amen-Ra. The first of the several races that entered the country was a Negroid people from Central Africa. They had, however, been displaced by various others before the Aryo-Egyptians returned from Arabia, settled near Abydos, and gradually, in a peaceful manner, became once more the dominant power. 2,400 years later, the Manu, under the name of Menes, incarnated, united the whole of Egypt under one rule, and founded at the same time the first dynasty and his great city of Memphis. This empire had already flourished for more than a millennium and a half before the reign of Ramesses the Great, who was himself the master of one of the principal lodges at the time when I had the honor to belong to it. The Grand Lodges. During the time when I was living in Egypt, the government of the country was directed from within the organization of the mysteries. Egypt was divided into 42 nomes or counties, and the nomarch or ruler of the county was the master of the principal lodge of the nome. There was a Grand Lodge, not to be confused with the 3 Grand Lodges of Amen to be described later, which consisted of all the nomarchs and of which the Grand Master was the Pharaoh. This Grand Lodge was convened at Memphis and worked a different ritual from those of the lower grades. It was to this body that the Pharaoh announced his decrees. For although his power in the land was almost absolute, yet before any serious decision was made, he always took counsel with his nomarchs, and judging by their decisions, they were a very capable body of men. Lesser matters were settled by an executive committee of this lodge over which the Pharaoh presided, but important steps were always discussed in Grand Lodge itself. Thus the mysteries entered into political as well as into religious life in the old days, and politics were much less selfish in consequence. There were in Egypt in those days 3 Grand Lodges of Amen, each of which was strictly limited to 40 members, every one of whom was a necessary part of the machine, including the officers whose business was the recitation of the office and the magnetization of the lodge. Each member was the representative of a particular quality. One was called the Knight of Love, another the Knight of Truth, another the Knight of Perseverance, and so on. And each was supposed to become a specialist in thinking and expressing the quality assigned to him. The idea was that the 40 qualities, thus expressed through the lodge as a whole, would make the character of a perfect man, a kind of heavenly man through whom the power behind could be poured out upon the whole country. These 3 Grand Lodges worked 3 distinct types of masonry, of which only one has come down to us in the 20th century. The master of the first Grand Lodge represented wisdom and his 2 wardens strength and beauty, as in our lodges today. The predominant power outpoured was that wisdom which is perfect love, the quality that is indeed most needed in the world at the present time. The master of the second Grand Lodge represented strength, and his wardens wisdom and beauty, and the strength of the first aspect of the Trinity was the predominant quality of the lodge. The master of the third Grand Lodge typified beauty, and the wisdom and the strength were made subordinate to that third aspect of the hidden light. As everyone present had to bear his part in building the form, exact cooperation and perfect harmony were absolutely necessary. And only people who could forget themselves entirely in the great work were selected from the ordinary lodges to become members of these 3 Grand Lodges, whose power was such that their influence covered the entire country. The slightest flaw in the character of one of the 40 members would have seriously weakened the form through which all the work was being done. It is perhaps a relic of this paramount necessity which dictates our present regulation that any brethren who are not in perfect harmony with each other should not put on their aprons until they have settled their differences. In ancient Egypt, there was an intensity of brotherly feeling between the members of a lodge which is probably rarely attained now. They felt themselves bound together by the holiest of ties, not only as parts of the same machine, but actually as fellow workers with God Himself. The ritual worked by the Grand Lodges was known as the building of the Temple of Amen. A translation of its actual wording will be given in another part of this book. It was indeed one of the most splendid and powerful sacraments known to man. It was celebrated for thousands of years, during which Egypt was a mighty land. But a time came when the egos most advanced in evolution began to seek incarnation in new nations, in which, as in different classes in the world school, they might learn new lessons. Then this portion of the Egyptian mysteries fell into abeyance, while the Egyptian civilization grew degenerate and formalized as it became a theater for the activities of less evolved men. The ordinary lodges. There were also dotted all about the country numerous other lodges which more closely resembled those of modern times. Their work was much more varied than that of the three Grand Lodges, and they met more frequently, for to them was entrusted the work of preparing their members for higher things and giving them a liberal education. Their purpose was the same as that of the mysteries everywhere, to provide a definite system of culture and education for adults, a thing which is not done on a large and public scale in our present day, when the rather curious belief is widely spread that education ends with school or college. The mysteries were the great public institutions, centers of national and religious life, to which people of the better classes flocked in thousands, and they did their work well. For one who had passed through their degrees, a process of many years, thereby became what we should now call a highly educated and cultured man or woman with, in addition to his knowledge about this world, a vivid realization of the future after death, of man's place in the scheme of things, and therefore of what was really worth doing and living for. Even in these ordinary lodges, every member took part in the work, and the labor of those in the columns was regarded as more arduous than that of the officers. Though the latter had special physical actions through which they must go with great accuracy, the former had to use their thought power all the time. They had all to join at certain points in the ritual in sending out streams of thought, more in the nature of willpower than of meditation, the object of the whole effort being to erect over and around the lodge a magnificent and radiant thought form of perfect proportions, specially constructed to receive and transmit in the most effective way the divine force which was called down by their act of devotion. If any member's thought was ineffectual, the mighty temple-like thought form was correspondingly defective in one part. But the master of the lodge was usually a clairvoyant priest or priestess who could see where the defect lay, and so could keep his lodge strictly up to the mark. Thus these lodges also shared in the same great work of force distribution, though on a smaller scale than the three Grand Lodges which were specially entrusted with that task. Without some purpose such as this, our great Masonic effort seems unintelligible. We have in nearly all Masonic lodges a beautiful opening ceremony, full of deep symbolical meaning, and when understood it is seen to be no mere form, but a wonderfully effective formula calling to our aid various entities and preparing the way for the performance of a very definite service to mankind. Yet, having opened our lodge and made all these preparations, we proceed at once to close down, unless we have a candidate to initiate or pass or raise or a lecture to deliver to our own people. Surely such a wonderful preparation should end in something definite, in a real piece of work for the benefit of mankind. In ancient Egypt there was this splendid work, the culmination to which all the preparations led up. Our true purpose should be the same. We meet and go through certain ceremonies and give them the name of work, a name that is quite inappropriate as applied to the mere ceremonies, no matter how full of meaning they may be. But if we are building a grand and beautiful form as a channel for the divine energy through which the world may be helped, then most assuredly we are doing work, collecting, concentrating and storing up great superhuman forces, and then, with the closing blessing, pouring all that out upon the world. Without this, all the preliminaries are, as it says in the co-Masonic mystic charge, like massive doorways leading no whither. There is no reason why we, in the present day, should not do as much with our ritual as did the ancient Egyptians. Any defects that may stand in the way are to be found not in the outer world, but in the failure on the part of the brethren to realize the seriousness of the work which they have undertaken, or to rise to the degree of unselfishness that is requisite to ensure regular attendance for the sake of humanity. In Egypt, no one troubled the brother secretary with letters of excuse. The brethren considered their membership the most valuable privilege and blessing of their lives, and were always in the lodge at the proper time unless too ill to move. Let us hope that Freemasonry will have a future worthy of its past, and that before long such lodges as they had in Egypt will be working in many parts of the world. There are various lines along which the recollection of the way in which the work was done in ancient Egypt may be of use to us, for those people performed their ceremonies with full knowledge of their meaning, and so the points upon which they laid great stress are likely to be important to us also. Deep reverence was their strongest characteristic. They regarded their temple much as the most earnest Christians regard their church, except that their attitude was dictated by scientific knowledge rather than by feeling. They understood that the temple was strongly magnetized, and that to preserve the full strength of that magnetism, great care was necessary. To speak of ordinary matters in the temple would have been considered as sacrilege, as it would mean the introduction of a disturbing influence. Vesting and all preliminary business was always done in the anteroom, and the brethren entered the lodge in procession, singing as co-masons do now. The history of Masonry. The mystery teaching of Egypt was very closely guarded, and it was only with great difficulty and under special conditions that anyone not an Egyptian born could be allowed to receive it. Still, it was given to various distinguished foreigners, and among others to Moses, of whom it is said in the biblical story that he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He passed on his knowledge to the Jewish priestly line, and thus it survived in a more or less defective form till the time of David and Solomon. When Solomon built his temple, he erected it on Masonic lines and made it a center of Masonic symbolism and work. He unquestionably intended his temple to demonstrate and to preserve for his people a certain set of measurements, in the same sort of way in which all kinds of astronomical and geodetic facts were enshrined in the measurements of the Great Pyramid. He did not succeed because much of the tradition had been lost. Or it would perhaps be truer to say that while external ceremonial and even the traditional ornamentation had been very fairly preserved, the clue to the meaning of it all was no longer known. Until that time, initiates of the Jewish mysteries had had their attention directed to the House of Light in Egypt. But King Solomon resolved to keep their thoughts and feelings strictly focused upon the building which he had himself erected. And therefore, instead of speaking to them of the symbolical death and resurrection of Osiris in Egypt, he invented the original form of our present traditional history to take its place. In fact, he Judaized the entire ritual, substituting Hebrew words for the original Egyptian, though in some cases at least preserving the original meaning. It should be remembered that in doing this he was only bringing the practice of his people into line with that of neighboring tribes and nations. There were many lines of mystery tradition, and though the Jews had brought with them across the desert of Sinai much of the Egyptian form, the Tyrians and others preserved rather the story of the descent of Tammuz or Adonis than that of the dismemberment of Osiris. Indeed, Brother Ward, in his latest book on this subject, seems inclined to advocate the theory that we as Masons owe comparatively little to Egypt and very much to Syria. In this briefest of outlines of Masonic history, I cannot pursue the question further, but I hope to say more upon it in my next volume, Glimpses of Masonic History. It is principally along this line of Jewish descent that Masonry has come down to us in Europe, though there have been other infiltrations. Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, who founded the Roman Collegia, established in connection with them a system of the mysteries which derived its Masonic succession from Egypt. But its ceremonies and teachings were somewhat modified by the migration of the rites of Attis and Cybele to Rome about 200 BC, and again through the medium of the soldiers returning from the campaigns of Vespasian and Titus. From the Collegia, this mingled tradition was handed on through the Comacini and various other secret societies through the dangerous times of the Middle Ages. And when a better age dawned and persecution became less fierce, it came to the surface once more. Certain fragments of it were gathered together in 1717 to form the Grand Lodge of England, and so it has come down to us unto the present day. It should be understood, however, that there is no one line of Masonic orthodoxy. A parallel tradition, coming originally from Chaldean sources, has given rise to Masonry as worked upon the continent of Europe. And yet another line seems to have been brought back by the Knights Templars on their return from the Crusades. The whole subject of Masonic history is one of exceeding interest. But owing to the fact that Masonry is, after all, a secret society, it is often almost impossible to trace the line of its descent by means of any documents which are now available. And consequently, there is great confusion and contradiction among the various accounts. We have ourselves devoted a good deal of investigation and research to this matter, and I have published some of its results in the book just mentioned, Glimpses of Masonic History. Much of the ancient wisdom has been allowed to slip into oblivion, and so some of the true secrets were lost to the great body of the brethren. But among the hierophants of the Great White Brotherhood, the true secrets have ever been preserved, and they will always reward the search of the really earnest Mason. We of these later subraces may prove ourselves just as unselfish and capable of just as good work for our fellowmen as were the people of old. Indeed, we ourselves may well be those men of old, come back in new bodies, and bringing with us the old attraction to the form of faith and work, which then we knew so well. Let us try to revive, under these far different conditions, the unconquerable spirit which distinguished us so long ago. It means a good deal of hard work, for every officer must do his part quite perfectly, and that involves much training and practice. Yet I feel sure that there are many who will respond to the Master's call and come forward to join in preparing the way for those who are to come. Let each lodge make itself a model lodge, thoroughly efficient in its working, so that when anyone visits it, he may be impressed by the good work done and by the strength of its magnetic atmosphere, and may thereby be induced to share in this vast undertaking. Our members must also be able, when they in turn visit other lodges, to explain our method of working and show how, from the occult point of view, the ceremonies should be performed. Above all, they must carry with them everywhere the strong magnetism of a completely harmonious center, the potent radiation of brotherly love. To us also, as to the ancient Egyptians, the lodge should be holy ground, consecrated and set apart for Masonic work, never to be used for any secular purpose. It should have an atmosphere of its own, just as have the great medieval cathedrals, as they are permeated by the influence of centuries of devotion. So should the very walls of our temple radiate strength, broad-mindedness, and brotherly love. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.